Okay, happy Monday to y'all. Welcome to the Common Good Podcast. I'm Doug Padgett. It is April 26th. You know, on our podcast, each day we take a little different theme. Some days we talk about politics. Some days we talk about faith. Some days we do science and economics. We always talk about news. Today we're talking about some issues that matter to us. And I am so pleased to be joined by Young Lee Hertig. Young is an organizer. She is a pastor. She is an organizational leader. And she's a good friend. So, Young, it's really good to have you on as we talk about what our response, especially a faithful response, can be to anti-Asian violence that so many of us have become newly aware of or again aware of in our society. So I like to remind people where I am, that I'm in Minneapolis, sitting down today. It's a lot to do with what my afternoon's going to look like. So if you're in the chat, we'd love to know where you are coming to us from. And we'd love for your voice to be part of this conversation. So put it in the chat. And I'll just mention for those that are watching on the chats, sometimes you don't see all the places for all the comments that come because we do this live stream on multiple Facebook pages, multiple Twitter accounts, multiple YouTube channels. So people are chiming in from different places. So if you see us talking about commentators, they might not only be in the feed that you're in. But glad to have you. And along with us as viewers, and those of you that are just on the podcast, thank you for being a part of this as well. Young, tell us a little bit about where you are. I was joking with you before we started that I'm in Minneapolis wearing a T-shirt, and you're having to dress for the cold weather.
It's early in the morning, and it's been cold. I'm based in Los Angeles. Sunny, sunshine city, but the weather has been different.
Yeah. Well, Young, we've known each other for a number of years, and it's always good to talk to you, but it's a little sad to speak on these issues that we have to take so seriously. Not only the issue of anti-Asian violence, but that the response of faith communities hasn't been all that it could be, it seems to me, in this area. So talk about what you do at Isaac, which is one of the organizations that you run. And then we'll talk about this conference that you have coming up online on the 29th in just a few days, called OneBreath, AAPI, Christian Reflections on Anti-Asian Violence, on the evening of, again, April 29th. So tell us what you do at Isaac, and then we'll jump into this important topic too.
I want to address from my first-hand experience, as Isaac is organizing pastoral lab for Asian American women ministers, funded by Lilly. And what this Atlanta shootings has done for many Asian American, particularly Asian American women, I have noticed how this particular incident triggered major, mental health issues, depression, anger, all the buried memories of their own first-hand experience of racism growing up. So some are lashing out in social media, some are weeping and crying. So it's from Canada to US. It's really tough, and mental health professionals are beyond their capacity.
And for a lot of people, they've been hearing about this issue, since the former president was using anti-Asian rhetoric in his administration consistently. He did it specifically around the COVID-19 virus. And then there were the shootings in Atlanta that targeted workers at spas that were predominantly Asian. But this issue of Asian violence in the United States, it's actually been around for a long time, and has really sat at sort of a low simmer. And then we get some boiling spots. And part of what you're going to raise in the conference on the 29th, the OneBreath live webinar, is that some of this, for a lot of people, especially in Los Angeles and in the Asian community, roots back to 1992 and the LA riots that came out of the beating of Rodney King. And I had actually forgotten about that piece of it until I reread your piece that you sent over, and then remembered my friend's who's Korean and grew up, and his parents ran a little mom and pop shop grocery store, and he talked about how formative that was in his life. And I had sort of, I don't know why I hadn't really connected that. It's almost like in some of our minds, some of these issues like police violence against Black Americans get separated
Mm-hmm.
out from Asian violence by citizen on citizen. And way back in 1992, these were linked. Can you tell us a bit of that story that is obviously not forgotten by the communities that you're a part of, and I will
I
shamefully
hope
admit
not.
was forgotten by me? Yeah.
You were living in Minneapolis, so you were far removed from the burning of the city. I still remember I was in Downey, California, and my daughter was 2 years old, watching all of a sudden Koreatown burning after the verdict was announced was just a heart wrenching. And all the areas that were burning, there were as many crosses, churches everywhere. What hit me very hard was the powerlessness of the gospel.
Hmm.
All the crosses are right there, and the city is burning, and the gospel of Jesus Christ had no power to intervene. So I wrote that piece in 2 hours.
Wow.
I was so angry after proposition hit, contrary to their announcement and promise that they're going to open grocery stores in South LA. And then the way Proposition 209 was framed, it was a very dubious framing, as if it is California Civil Rights Initiative, but it was, ending of affirmative action, Prop
What
209.
what was Proposition 209 back in the early 90s? What was that about?
California Civil Rights Initiative, and tons of money was pumped in,
Hmm.
and people thought they were voting for civil rights. But in fact, it's
Huh.
canceling affirmative action. So it's Prop 209.
Wow.
So blow after blow, rather than reforming police violence, um, it just kept on going to oppress Black people and people of color. I'll never forget that incident. Just watching the city burning many Korean American mom and pop store. And let me assure you that the cops didn't come. Cops went to Beverly Hills to protect their property. So these store owners had to be on the rooftop, when some even pointed gun. And the media, white upper middle class media back then, we didn't have social media, kept on showing that store owner protecting their own store because cop wouldn't come to Koreatown where it's burning.
So, for people who don't remember the trial, the police officers who beat Rodney King, and it was one
Yes.
of the more famous police violence videos. Those police officers were acquitted, and when they were acquitted, the city exploded. Much of the country did, but especially L.A., because it seemed it was not dissimilar from the film footage that we've seen, in recent years, and makes you say your eyes tell you what the truth is. And in this situation, we could all see it, and yet the system still, was on the side of the police. And when that happened, one of the
Mhm.
areas that was specifically targeted in the riots was Koreatown. And then when Korean store owners were trying to protect their property, then they were pitted or talked about in the media as somehow being a part of some some conflict with the Black community in LA. Is that right? Do I remember that part
Yes.
right?
And I think I
Yeah.
was so angry at that because once again, the Watts riots were economic issue between Jews and Black. In 1992, it was Korean, American, and Black. But notice, where did the cops go and whose property did they protect?
Mm-hmm.
That's where it's an economic issue, a totally capitalistic endeavor. So, property over people, especially people of color. So, the way media framed at that time really irked me. And it wasn't as much as Black and Korean Americans, it was purely economic and capitalistic issue that they skipped.
Now that we're 30 years later, it's got to be
Approaching 30th year. Next year is the 30th
next year, 30th
anniversary.
year. It's got to be exhausting that we're still that anti-Asian violence is still something that's happening in our society, and it's. But do you feel like the situation has changed in this last year as the larger American community has responded, or do you feel like we're still sort of walking around the same tree that we've been walking around for all of these past 3 decades?
Well, I lived in Minnesota, St. Paul, Minnesota, and my husband is Minnesotan. And, little kudos to you. How many people had to come out and fight for justice? And Minneapolis delivered last week. It's a progress, but it's only just beginning, not an end for seeking justice and police reform. Um, what was your question again? It's just
Do you feel like the
any
anti-Asian
progress.
violence and hate is in a different place in our society? Like, are more people paying attention to it? Do you feel
I
more?
think we got visibility, and now, unlike 30 years ago, we have many Asian American scholar slash activists, and people are marching. And I think social media, smartphone helps.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to just rely on mainstream media to cover our stories told by our people. So, on the one hand, it has progressed, but on the other hand, it just is. I know many people whose parents, grandparents were spat on and knocked down on the street randomly. So, can you imagine? Not Mississippi, but in San Francisco, in Chinatown, Asian American, Chinese American cannot walk safely. So they paired up with the young people that these to protect elderly people from being attacked. So they are escorting them to and from wherever they were going. So this also triggers collective history of Chinese Exclusion Act, Japanese, internment, you name it. I think Asian Americans are the only people group in America that American policies targeted people group. And we've been victimized by that. So my answer to your question is no, it hasn't progressed. It's
Right.
gotten worse over last, 5 years. Thank God we don't have to be bullied by top officer in America every day.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, those points you're bringing up about the Chinese Exclusion Act, preventing Chinese people, even who worked in the early stages of the
Mhm.
Western expansion of this country. And of course, the internment camps during the time of World War II for the Japanese, and then the Vietnam War, and then the Korean War. And much of the narrative in the United States around Asian communities has been a narrative that's the subtext of which is violence. And do you, I'm careful about this question because I know this is so personal and traumatizing, and that's why you're doing the webinar that you're going to do, with health professionals and other clergy on the 29th, because so many people in the Asian community have been so deeply impacted, and it's hard to get it out. But can you talk a little bit for people for whom, with the myriad of important social issues, that would really care about this issue of how Asian communities are seen in our society, and what the difficulty and struggle and pain is? And as you, someone who has moved between Asian communities, and married to a Minnesotan, so you're in a biracial marriage, and you move in between communities, and you do a lot of crossing into non-Asian spaces. Can you give people a little help and understanding of the personal side of this? Because I worry sometimes that the news headlines again make people only think about Asian communities in light of some kind of harm or trauma, and even that is not talking it doesn't allow people to access the full scope of the Asian experience. So can you just talk a little bit about what people who don't keep up with these topics should know, and how they could know about what's going on in the anti-Asian violence efforts?
For this trauma, I'm going to frame my answer as trauma of being perceived as perpetual foreigners. It doesn't matter whether you were born in the United States or not, what generation you are. Even you could be third generation Asian American, but still you are perceived as perpetual foreigner. You speak English well. Where did you pick that up? And that otherized identity that, to be honest with many Asian American I work with, sometimes they're more white than white in the way they are conditioned, in the way they think. They're only Asian is symbolic identity with food and how they look. But I think this is a sort of an inflection point that they cannot afford to just being monolingual, and they cannot afford to not knowing, their Asian heritage. So at Isaac, Innovative Space for Asian American Christianity, what you say can disappear. But I think what we mean by bridging the academy, church, and community, we have to document. Knowledge is power. And if we don't document our Christian legacies from our lens, we have to perpetually pioneer, and that's exhausting. So we cover, we work hard. We volunteer to produce annual journal called Christianity Next. And in that issue, number 5, we talked about trauma and resilience, neurobiology, race, and faith. And there are quite a few Asian American women documenting the trauma from being transplanted and the trauma of not being fully recognized as American. The color of America is white, and this goes on in overseas as well. When I travel to Southeast Asia, I'm not American. They'll hound you until I say I'm not from America, but they don't, leave you alone. You have to spell out.
And you're saying that's because the perception in other parts of the world is that America means white.
Exactly. On the other hand, look at, I didn't watch Oscar. I had another event last night, but Yoon Yoon just got the Best Supporting Actress Award. And now McDonald's is going to have a menu called BTS. So, this Korean drama and Korean soft culture is just, my students are telling me to watch such and such drama. And it is amazing. It's enthralling. But on the other hand, in America, while they are eating Korean food and they are interested in Korean drama and film and music, on the ground, if you have Asian face, you are being attacked. So think about that.
Does it feel like there's a new level of fear within the Asian community, or is the fear of violence something that many of us are knowing about now, but has been around?
There's a permanent psychological scar. So I find myself surveying my surroundings when I go out. It's because it's so random that anybody at any moment can, attack you. So I was told to carry mace, and I still didn't buy that. But this really changed our everyday life, that it's not safe to walk alone anywhere, anytime.
Yeah, and what's striking to me about it is that the cases that I know about of the current rash of anti-Asian violence includes places and major cities that, I guess I was assuming that there was a sense that, maybe that kind of bigotry and cruelty would grow in places where familiarity with people of different backgrounds isn't the case. But like you say, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Atlanta, New York City.
Yeah.
I mean, these are the places where we're seeing the footage, the video footage. And I know from people who, Asian friends of mine, who say, but look, this is happening all over the country. And oftentimes it's never reported. Churches often know about it. Church leaders will know about it because so many people in Asian communities are connected to churches, and that can serve as a part of their cultural, superstructure. So they'll talk about it there, but they don't report to the police. They don't go to the media. There's a lot of pain and shame in it. So I guess it's surprising to me that that these places are that it's not just a lack of familiarity, right? Because there's a story in the United States that there's people who live in certain parts of our country that don't have a lot of cross-cultural experience, and that's what brews the situation for this kind of bigotry and racism. But it's actually happening in all the places. It's not only happening in those places.
I don't think we have a space to cross-talk and cross boundaries. We are so siloed, and in big cities, you don't have to interact with any other races because you have enough and big size of your own ethnic, and you can remain in your ethnic enclave. I think even with social media, we are becoming more and more tribalized. And even you get to choose your own network and your own media where you reinforce what you believe. So creating intersectional space takes a lot more work. And yet we have to roll our sleeves. And I appreciate all your activism, Doug. And I want to say we are at a better place than a year ago in terms of American policies and what comes out of the top office. So I'm optimistic. I'm miserably optimistic. And yet I think Asian American pulpit still operates majority at large, otherworldly, salvific notion. And they do not address public theology, taking the gospel to public arena and public square. And who is filling that out? It's all John Piper, Tim Keller. I don't want to say all the names, but
I don't have to say those names.
Christian nationalism, that's scary.
Yeah, it's scary.
So this is a theological problem.
It is a theological, and you're raising it on both sides. You're saying that in the Asian American church that it's also an issue, and most certainly in the non-Asian American churches. I mean, the number of times that people will talk about Asian violence or AAPI. For those who are new to that term, it's Asian American Pacific Islander as a category. Like that's even new to a lot of people. And when people think of race in the United States, they tend to think about the phrases of black and brown people, and a lot of people don't consider Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders to be in that category, right? They tend to think it's people from Central and South America and African American heritage, African heritage peoples. But there's the fact that people don't think about it doesn't mean it's not built into our society. And the fact that a lot of other Americans were not totally intolerant of the former president being as disparaging as he was about, with phrases that he would use and categories that he would use, just shows that there's a real ignorance about the importance of understanding this particular moment and this particular pain. And we used to joke when we were spending all of our time trying to get rid of Donald Trump as the president that we know that having a new president isn't going to solve all of our problems. But the president of the United States shouldn't be the problem. And this man was particularly problematic and needed to stop, having the power of the presidency at his disposal. But now we do end up find ourselves working on these other issues. Do you have any sense of what's going on in the political spaces? Like I was a little surprised that two of the women, congresswomen from California that are
Orange
Asian
County.
background. I know Orange County, and they are hardcore Republican hard right leaders. So I had some mixed emotion about what was going on there, right? I mean, Asian women leaders are very, something that seems like a really good move. Their political stance, I would, feeling a crosswinds about all that. But do you have a sense of what's happening in the political sphere of how the country's responding to the Asian community?
I mean, I appreciate Grace Meng, Congresswoman, with her effort that bipartisan bill was passed, anti-AAPI hate crime bill. So that's a progress. That woman you are referring to, a congresswoman from Orange County, actually is a Christian. So, Doug, and I know the propaganda and how that works, that this subtext, God is Republican. Somehow that narrative really sits deep in Asian American Christianity. Conservative and progressive ism is a disdain. So that's why I'm deeply committed to talking about public theology, political theology. That's our next issue that we will be publishing. We cannot afford to leave our public square with Christian nationalism.
Right.
We need to change that.
They will fill the void, I promise you. If you stay silent, somebody will start speaking up in your place. It'll be
exactly
Christian nationalists.
And they mobilize, and this QAnon phenomenon, conspiracist theory, and the former president still having influence in GOP, all of these, I think Christianity and Christians bear responsibility.
Well, I agree with you wholeheartedly, my friend. All right, let's talk a little bit about this webinar that's up and coming. You call it OneBreath, AAPI, Christian Reflections on Anti-Asian Violence. It's online. It's free on April 29th, 5 p.m. Pacific time. Figure out your time zones from there. Is this open to anyone, or is it really designed for people from the Asian community?
It's for everybody. Okay. Remember, it's one breath, God's ruah.
Yeah. Okay. Talk about that. Why the title One Breath?
We've been talking about I Can't Breathe with George Floyd and so many others who are being slaughtered before our eyes. And the breath doesn't have color. We all breathe. God breathed God's breath into us. So we want to make sure that we Christians come together and unite. And Reverend Lawrence Dove is one of the most multicultural African-American RCA pastor who's partnered with us, mentored our young adult. And I sent Korean-American young adult and Filipina to his church. Doug, many American-born had never entered into traditionally Black churches. Right. I sent them to Fame and they were shocked. And I sent them to West Angeles Church of God in Christ, and their eyes were literally about to pop out as they worship in that space. They have never ventured out to that space, even though they're nearby. So Lawrence Dove is an amazing leader. And Hannah Lee is married to Latino, and she's a social worker. And James Kang is United Methodist, and he is the only Korean American male, and he decided not to get ordained, even though he's got MD from Claremont School of Theology. He is more of an entrepreneur, and he's organizing more of a consulting role. He worked at the bishop's office for quite some time, and he volunteered for Isaac so many years. And Miyoung Hammer is a department chair at Fuller Theological Seminary School of Psychology, Marriage and Family Therapy. And she will shine some light about the impact of these racism in our body, mind, and spirit. So you are in for a treat, and we're going to talk about a little bit about our own memories of LA riots. Where were you at the time? And then we'll visit current anti-AAPI hate crime and what we're going to do about it.
And for people who are new to this topic, this would be a good place for beginning, right? If people are not that they wouldn't know about the news, but if they're really thinking about the impact that this has on the Asian American community. When I saw this and reached out to you and said, can we at Vote Common Good promote this and share it? I was assuming that would be the case. I mean, it's great panelists. You're a great leader in this area. So this really is designed for people who are
everybody
new as much as people who are familiar, right?
A bulk of activism is showing up, isn't it?
Yeah.
Show up. You all are welcome. Even if you are Asian haters, you are welcome.
Yeah. And the idea that mental health care is an important aspect here, that's new, right? Even especially in the Asian community. I mean, it's new, frankly, in a lot of our society. There's still a lot of places where people think that mental health support is something that they shy away from or are nervous about or don't feel, comfortable talking about publicly. But that's especially true in the Asian American community, isn't it? That the pursuit of narratives of mental health for your support is something that someone should try.
I think more so in the church because of stigma attached, but it is changing. LA Times reported how many Asian Americans are seeking mental health professionals, but they are overbooked and they have to turn them down. So things have changed. And just so you know, the highest rate of suicide is Asian Americans. I've seen a
Really?
faculty's sister who made it to MIT and she hung herself. Uh, there's a lot of suicide happening.
Mm.
I mean, it's a national trend, but Asian American tops all of it.
Mm.
An Asian
Wow.
American household exceeded white household in terms of income. So what is happening here? We might have to do some soul searching and soul care. American dream can turn into American nightmare. And how do we build humanity that is healthier rather than
Yeah. Yeah.
just pursuing money and profit and property?
Yeah. There is so much trauma
Hmm.
in the bodies of people in this country. It's
Hmm.
trauma therapy, trauma narratives. They're new for the psychological and health world. A lot of it came out of people returning from war. You think
Hmm.
back to when we were kids and people would come back from war, and it was just sort of, I don't know, dad or grandpa. He had a hard time in the war, and that was sort of it. Just leave the man sitting in the corner
Hmm.
staring off into space. It wasn't really addressed the way that after the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War, post traumatic stress disorder was starting to become not only understood, but
Hmm.
something that could be diagnosed and therefore could receive the full support of the medical
Hmm.
and mental health industries. So we're now in a place where we know how to talk about trauma and we know how to talk about post traumatic responses. The,
Hmm.
when you use that lens, this country of ours, it is riddled with post traumatic narratives from violently taking the lands from the indigenous peoples
Hmm.
to enslavement of Africans to build an economy, to the enslavement of Asian peoples to come in and build this country and then treat them in ways that they couldn't survive. The physical violence, the separation of women from political powers, like it is just constant and being almost in a constant state of war
Hmm.
since our founding of the revolution and being on a war footing and then being told on a regular basis that we need armed military styled police on our streets to keep us safe from one another. Like all of this is trauma producing. Like any of that, if you are dealing in the area of trauma, which I know you'll talk about in the webinar that's up and coming, all of that, a clinical approach would say, if that was an individual that lived through any, it would say you have some serious trauma in your life and in your body.
Hmm.
So I think it's really wonderful that you are engaging the people that you are in this conversation, and as you say in the description, talking about what are the stories of pain and resilience that exist, and how is this all impacting our communities, and reflect on the role that violence has played in traumatizing a people, and not just separate individual racial groups, but the
Hmm.
United States as a people group is a profoundly traumatized society.
I recommend the audience, if you haven't, please check out the New Yorker's article, the Pentagon paper, Daniel Ellsberg,
Hmm.
and what he had to go through as he was against Vietnam War and the consequences. I mean, it was really well written article and
Hmm.
eye opening how war is profiteering
Hmm.
scheme. It comes down
Wow.
to money.
Yeah.
And the country is built upon, subjugating people. And I think you're right. Collective trauma that's buried, not addressed, is one of the sense I make. Why America is so obsessed with gun.
Yeah.
When you look at America
Wow.
from
Yeah.
outside in,
Hmm.
it doesn't make any sense
Wow.
that 7-year-old, the recently 16-year-old Black girl was shot to death by police. This issue is a no-brainer the minute you step outside of the United States. This just doesn't make any sense. And this ongoing trauma from gun violence, acting out and rotating violence rather than being healed by addressing it. I don't know, but I think we have to talk about it. And talking cure, I guess, rather than burying it, may be a starting point. And it's an uncomfortable issue. You know, Minnesota nice. I think you are an exception, but you know, another layer is that you have to be nice. You cannot talk honestly the truth. Brutal honesty is not accepted in this culture. I often get misunderstood because I'm
For
raw.
being blunt.
Yeah, and I'm saying what it is because I cannot couch it. So I have to step back and, okay, how can I sugarcoat? But that violates my conscience. So I say as it is.
Well, I'm glad you do, Young. I am really glad that you do. I'm glad you said it here, and really proud that you're saying it in the webinar. Again, we'll let people know it's coming up here in just a couple of days. So on the 29th, which is Thursday, at 5 p.m. Pacific time, you can join Lee and the other panelists for this free webinar. Share it widely if y'all would. Share it with your friends. There's a link here in the video stream, and it'll be in the show notes as well. If you ever can't remember where it is and you remember you heard it on the Vote Common Good podcast, go to votecommongood.com. We have it listed there on our website too as one of the events, and check your email. It comes out in our email. So, Young, thank you so much. Really good to talk to you and good to see you. And we will see you on Thursday night in the webinar.
Thank you for all your good work, Doug.
You bet.
Common
Thanks,
good.
my friend.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
All right, friends. Hey, we'll see you tomorrow at our normal time, 10 a.m. At least I'm planning to. I'm going to get a Pfizer vaccine in this arm, my second one. So I'm going to come in just, vaccine loaded up. So if that all works out, it should be on. Or if I just have the chills, I don't know, I might do it that way too.
Mm-hmm.
And you can join us tomorrow night if you'd like, friends, when we have our fourth installment of our Threat of Christian Nationalism webinar. We're joined by Kristen Dumais as our content provider and Shane Claiborne as somebody giving a reflection. And of course, all of you, if you sign up for it, you can get all the information about this over at votecommongood.com. If you're listening on the podcast and you always listen a day late, hurry, because it's happening on Tuesday, the 27th. So it's our final one. You can watch all of those. They're all recorded. They're on our Facebook streams, they're on our YouTube channel. They'll be in the podcast. They'll be all in all the places. So you can keep up with it. But join us live tomorrow when we talk about what the response of Christian nationalism can be. And we're going to have a little bit on this issue of capitalism and how it plays into fueling Christian nationalism in this country, what people are willing to give way to for a buck or two. We'll be talking about that Wednesday, faith leaders. Thursday, Diana Butler Bass has a new book out. We're going to talk about her book called Freeing Jesus, and then we'll be talking economics on Friday. A lot going on, and I will add that you're going to be getting some information about us doing a border bike tour from San Diego, California to St. Augustine, Florida, September 10th through November 13th. You don't have to ride a bike to be with us. It's better if you do, but you don't have to. There's other ways you can do it to come along with us on part of that journey on those days. Or if you're saying, I can't go those days, I can't travel across the country on a bike, maybe you could do a community bike ride. You can find out more information about that as well, or just join us virtually as we raise awareness about immigration and border practices that we know can change to common good immigration and border practices. We're going to raise awareness around all those important issues. So thanks for being a part of the Vote Common Good community. Thanks for following along on the Common Good podcast and live stream, and we will see you tomorrow.